Today, we have the delight of listening to some wonderful conversation from Mike Trigg and Mehran Sahami about Mike's new book, Bitcoin. Mike spent over 20 years in Silicon Valley's tech industry before becoming an author. He has been a founder, executive, and employee at dozens of venture-backed startups, including Hightail, Hive, and Epiphany. He has also been an angel investor, advisor of several venture capital funds, and a contributor to TechCrunch, Entrepreneur, and Fast Company. Born in Kentucky and raised in Wisconsin, Trigg earned a BA from Northwestern University and an MBA from UC Berkeley. Bitflip is his first novel. In conversation with Mike today is Mehran Sahami. Mehran is the, I hope that I don't mess this up, he's the James and Eleanor Cheesebrough Professor in the School of Engineering and Associate Chair for Education and Computer Science at Stanford University. He is also the Robert and Ruth Halperin University Fellow in Undergraduate Education. Sahami earned his BS and PhD from Stanford University. Prior to joining the Stanford faculty, he was a senior research scientist at Google and a senior engineering manager at Epiphany. Sahami is the co-author with fellow Stanford faculty Rob Reich and Jeremy Weinstein of System Error, Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot. Please join me in welcoming both Mehran Sahami and our author, Mike Trigg.
Wonderful.
Yeah, we'll just jump right
Do you
in.
want to? Should we? Can you hear us okay? Yeah, I feel like there is a fair amount of ambient noise. I feel like I'm doing a stand-up comedy routine now with this.
All your drum ensemble. So thanks everyone for coming. Welcome to this discussion of Mike Trigg's new book, Bitflip. It really is a wonderful read. I was going to give an introduction to Mike, but that's already been taken care of, so I think we're good to go there. So let's just start off. First of all, congratulations on the release of the book. I really enjoyed reading it. I think the book does a really nice job of weaving together a narrative, a satire, a morality play, and a thriller all in one. And it's just a great read. It tells us something about the cultural state.
Thank you. Yeah, it was kind of my dream to do a book event at this location of Book Passage because there's a scene in the book, I forget what chapter it's in, that takes place right there. And so, in fact, there's several Bay Area landmarks in the book. So it's really fun to be here, especially on such a gorgeous day.
So let's kind of jump right in and start by asking you. You've been in the tech industry for over 20 years, plus 25, or maybe even over 25 now. Tell us what are the experiences that inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, when you have almost 25 years in tech, you've got a lot of material to work with. I think the core inspiration, I, like a lot of busy professionals, didn't read a ton of fiction books. I mostly read nonfiction. I read a lot of business books about Silicon Valley, biographies, and there's some wonderful ones out there. Some of my favorite books, including System Error, your book, Aaron, are just wonderful insights into the business world and the business culture. But in the fiction aisle, I just didn't see very many books that I thought authentically portrayed life in Silicon Valley, contemporary life in Silicon Valley, the good, the bad, the ugly. And so that was kind of the original inspiration. Is I felt like I wanted to write a book that I felt like I would want to read, and that imparted some of the wisdom, I guess, if you will, or experiences that I've had along the way. And kind of the benefit of those 25 years is your perspective on life in Silicon Valley and life in tech startups. A little of the bloom goes off the rose, and I hope that it was a little bit more honest portrayal of life, because a lot of what I read in the nonfiction aisle is kind of either glorifies or vilifies tech people, and I think the real story is a little more nuanced than that.
I think the book does a good job of capturing that kind of struggle. I think early on in the book, one of the things we see is Sam Hughes, the protagonist, has a little bit of a crisis at a conference that he goes to for entrepreneurs, where he's one of the speakers. And I thought maybe we could kick off a little reading from the book by reading the passage where, just to set the scene, Sam is at this conference, he's been asked to speak, he's filling in for the CEO of the company because he's the COO. It's a very interesting piece.
There's also a high degree of difficulty because I don't have my readers, I'm holding a microphone, I'm holding a book one-handed, so pardon me in advance if I flub up. Oh, Mark is offering me his readers. Okay, I'll fumble through it. So. All right, so Sam is on stage, he's part of the panel discussion, and he kind of has this moment of clarity. Sam clasped his hands, cleared his throat, and leaned forward into his chair. Maybe I've just been here too long and gotten a little cynical. Maybe we're all fed this narrative about success when we come to Silicon Valley. I remember sitting out there in the audience and watching people like us talk. We use the language of humility and virtue and modesty, but really, we're all just bragging. We remember how envious we felt about those lucky ones who raised big rounds or had successful exits. So now we want you to feel that same envy, that jealousy, to hold us in high esteem for our amazing accomplishments. That's the fuel that keeps the Valley going. Greed and envy and pride and all the other deadly sins are the core flywheel of who we are. We may sugarcoat it in rhetoric about making the world a better place, but for the most part, that's bullshit. We're motivated by fame and fortune, just like everyone else, more so than everyone else. Without your naive optimism, your willingness to take the riskiest 1 in a million bets, Silicon Valley doesn't exist. The machine stalls. The story you're told by entitled entrepreneurs and your friends at other companies and investors in the tech press is just that, a story, ostensibly to inspire you, but in reality, it entraps you, destines you to expend your energy and creativity for the enrichment of investors, measures you only by the size of your exits, values you only by the esteem of others. Don't let yourself be a victim of that one narrative. And at that point, Sam storms off stage. It's really kind of this, it's a moment, as an executive at a lot of startups, and there are a lot of tech conferences, so there's plenty of opportunity to do these. I would speak at conferences like this often. I'm sure you've been in that position quite a bit. And it is a lot of humble brags on that stage, and there is an expected sort of rhetoric that people have. And I sort of had this moment of like, what if you burst the bubble right at that moment? What if you kind of had that, honest truth speak right on stage? And Sam in the next chapter, unfortunately, gets fired for his honesty. So the book kind of kicks off from there.
Yeah, it's a nice parallel because, as you hear Sam saying these things, you realize that he's going through an identity crisis. He's part of this whole thing and having this realization that he then makes very public. And I think part of the larger lesson that you're giving there is kind of the view that maybe all of Silicon Valley has a little bit of an identity crisis. So what do you mean by that? How do you think about the Valley having a crisis?
Yeah, that sentiment is captured in the title. So a bit flip is a sort of a technical term in binary code. It's when a bit, represented by a 0 or 1, flips from one to the other. And in the title of the book, it's being used sort of metaphorically for that change of heart. And I think that was something that I was personally going through at that time. Struggling with: do I want to stay in tech? Do I want to pursue a career as a writer? I was writing this book nights and weekends for a while and wasn't making very much progress. And it was actually over COVID that I had the chance to sort of step back and say, all right, I'm going to commit to this full time. If not now, I never will. And so that was the moment where I really kind of buckled down and got it written, got it published, and got it out in the world.
So how do you go from this notion of, thinking about the experiences you went through, right? Things like talking on the stage, thinking about the crises of conscience that sometimes people feel, and kind of a lot of the little vignettes that we see throughout the book, and then taking that all together and turning it into a book. What's that process like?
Well, yeah, that was the challenging part. I had the original kernels of a book were a bunch of just amusing anecdotes that I kind of kept myself of things that I saw, experiences I had in my career in the Valley, and I'd come home and share my day with Leslie and vent about things that I experienced. And she'd be like, "You should write a book. You should write a book. This is funny stuff." But unfortunately, I realized that a bunch of anecdotes don't actually make a novel. They're just kind of boring anecdotes. And so I had to kind of really figure out what the actual structure of the story was going to be. And my first draft was, I think, a little bit more rose-hued glasses, to be totally honest. The scene that I just read happened toward the end of the original book. Sam comes to this realization of like, oh gosh, misgivings about Silicon Valley kind of late in the narrative. After working with my developmental editor, we actually flipped the script and started with that opening. And instead had Sam's character kind of go down a little bit of a slippery slope in terms of his ethical behavior. And so that ended up being a much more fun, much more, I think, engaging story to write and a more interesting kind of evolution of Sam's character.
So in that first passage, you'd see, as you mentioned, Sam having that change of heart. You mentioned that you had kind of a similar change of heart. So tell us a little bit more about that. What was that journey like for you in terms of the actual change of heart?
Yeah, I think, there was a little bit of a watershed moment, I think, around, near aftermath of the 2016 election and the recognition that big tech platforms, obviously most notably Facebook and Instagram and others, could be exploited, could be manipulated. And I think, that was around the time that you sort of first started, well, maybe a little before that, but you first started to see the term big tech being used in the same meaning of that word as you heard big pharma or big oil or other kinds of industries. And, I think for me and for a lot of people in the technology industry, it sort of did cause this little bit of a whipsaw of, wait a minute, this isn't all great stuff. I kind of came here to the Valley in 96, as Sam does and a few years later, pretty starry-eyed. I sort of felt like we're making the world a better place, and yeah, we're gonna make gobs of money while we do it, but we're good guys. We're the good guys. There was a great self-reassurance about that sentiment. And as some of those things sort of started to break, and the power and exploitation of some of these big tech platforms really, we all became sort of more aware of that. I think it really caused a little bit of crisis of confidence or identity crisis, or whatever you want to call it, where a lot of people in tech, myself included, sort of felt like, gosh, I don't know if this is making the world a better place. I think there's a lot of elements of the tech industry that are negative. There's many, many elements of the tech industry that are incredibly positive. Our lives, and lives of millions of people have been vastly improved by the technology sector. Life in Silicon Valley and the Bay Area here has been improved by it, but there's a lot of downsides too. And I think your book examines those things in a very clear-eyed way. From a nonfiction standpoint, I think my book wants to really examine those things from a fictional standpoint.
Sure. And when you're talking about big tech, one of the things that people always think about is kind of the mottos like "Don't be evil." Right? 20 years ago, I was at Google, and we really believe "Don't be evil." And I think now that's seen as a little bit more of kind of a punchline for a joke than as a real mantra for a company. How do you think about it? How do you think about, is that true of big tech? Do you see more evil happening? And if so, are there particular areas you see it in?
I think there's a line in the book, another rant of Sam's, which is sort of my voice in Sam's head, where, don't be evil is the mantra, we just keep moving the goalposts. And I think there's been a lot of that. I think there's a lot of rationalization that goes on within tech companies. I've been on that side. I was at a big social networking company called High Five. It was at its time back in 2008 to 2010. It was one of the largest websites in the world. And, I think something happens to the human brain when you get abstracted from what you're doing a little bit. You can be looking at a key performance indicator or some metric that you're trying to hit in the company that maybe your bonus is predicated on or your company's stock prices is going to move based on. And you can become very myopically focused on that metric. And so I think it's really important for people in the tech industry, especially ones who have the power of a platform that has the scale that a Facebook or Instagram or Google or others have, to not lose sight of what they're doing and how what they do impacts millions of people. I think everybody was pretty horrified when the Facebook papers came out, revealing how aware they were of the addictiveness of the platform, and yet I guarantee you the people within the organization were rewarded and incented to make the platform more and more addictive. To drive that next clip, drive that next view. That's what drives revenue. That's what drives page views. So I think everybody in the tech industry really has a responsibility to have a greater awareness of that.
That makes a lot of sense. And one of the examples we talked about too was places like YouTube, where they set this goal of they wanted to have 1 billion hours of watch time of YouTube videos per day. And they actually got to that goal and exceeded it, and that was the metric they were focused on. And when you focus on a metric like that, you're not thinking a lot about, well, what about the 10-year-olds who are spending all day glued to the screen because you just keep showing them stuff that they want to click on.
Yeah, and I think we all need to be more aware as consumers too, because the other sort of dirty secret about these big tech platforms is that everything is measured, everything is A/B tested, all this stuff is analyzed. Yeah, you can blame YouTube for feeding right-wing videos to somebody, and they become more and more what's the term? Radicalized. Thank you. Yet they watch that video, right? And you can run that analysis. You can see that they watch that video. And so I think it's really important as a consumer of technology to be aware of your own behaviors. Why do I click on a certain image or video or statement? Outrage is an incredibly activating emotion, right? And not to get political, it can happen on the left and on the right, right? Like I click on plenty of things because as a liberal Democrat, I'm outraged, right? I'm like, I can't believe that, and I click on it and I read it, and that drives a pattern of kind of clickbait and misinformation and stuff like that I think is causing greater polarization in our country.
It's interesting because you said, you're a pretty liberal person, left-wing person, as am I, but you grew up in the Midwest. You were born in Kentucky, you grew up in Wisconsin, places that aren't necessarily considered radical places.
Well, you got to go to Madison.
maybe it's the particular city you're in. But and then you look at Sam, the protagonist in the book, right? He goes back to his hometown in Ohio. There's this really moving interchange he has with his dad there. And when you read that and you sort of know your background, you think about, well, how much of Mike is in this story? How much of yourself did you put in?
Yeah, Sam's Midwestern roots are pretty core to who he is and pretty core to who I am. I picked Ohio. I sort of laughed when I realized mentally the hops I'd gone through. I grew up in Wisconsin, born in Kentucky, went to college in Illinois. My dad's from Michigan, my mom's from Minnesota. So I kind of picked the last Midwestern state that I didn't have a direct connection to. And then my son ended up going to college in Ohio. So, who knows how things happen. I think there's a lot of benefit to spending time in so-called purple states. Again, my own political disposition notwithstanding, I think having diversity of political opinion is an axis of diversity. That is an important one, right? And I'm not talking extreme fringes on either side, but Wisconsin is an interesting state. As I said, it's my hometown. Was the home of McCarthy, right, in the 50s, but it also has Madison in the state, and Ohio is another state where you have very liberal areas, very conservative areas. And that mixing is healthy. It humanizes people on the other side. It fosters dialogue. And again, I think that's one of the negative aspects of technology platforms is it really takes that away. It really gives you a self-affirmation loop, whether you recognize it or not. And sometimes you need to break out of that or challenge it.
That's really good advice, especially given the reinforcement constantly given online. I just want to give you a little note. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, then I'm going to open it up to audience questions. So if you want to already start thinking about what you want to ask Mike about this book, that would be fantastic. Getting back to the book itself, I think the book is really wonderful. There's a lot of things I took out of it, including real, deep thinking about values, about the culture of the area. There were some tidbits of the history of the area I didn't know about, so I got that out of the book. There were a lot of things that I got out of it. What do you want readers to get out of it?
Probably the simplest way to paraphrase it is, be aware of your own culpability in our society, really. I mean, I tried to write a book that doesn't have sort of traditional good guys and bad guys, villains and whatever. Sam, like all of us, has a compromised personality, right? And it has a little bit of good and a little bit of bad in him. And, there's another scene in the book where he starts to suspect this, suspicious activity, potential fraud within this company, and he's wondering, what do I do about this? Like, who do I report it to? How do I solve this? And that was another sort of deliberate thing, which is the recognition that within the tech industry, there really isn't a lot of supervision, and we've been allowed to supervise ourselves. And I think with that, there's a whole separate discussion we could get into about whether the tech industry should be more regulated or not. Just wrote a post on Literary Hub that argues to not. But we all have a lot of responsibility, those of us in the tech industry, and a lot of power. And I think when you're in that sort of position of self-oversight, you need to be thoughtful, you need to be responsible, you need to act ethically. The litmus test that I always think was a good one is if that was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, how would you feel about it? And that's a pretty good check and balance to anything you're doing on a day-to-day basis.
That's also good advice for any email you write.
That is great. I say that to people under like 30, and they're like, "What's the Wall Street Journal?"
You're like, assume it's going to get posted to Instagram.
Right, exactly. That's a better comparison.
So people oftentimes think of the process of writing a book like giving birth to a child, right? It takes some time, there's a lot of energy and effort that goes into it. Finally, you see it go out in the world, you want to see it kind of grow up nicely. But then one of the questions you almost immediately get afterward is, are you thinking about another one? So where are you in the process?
I'm not only thinking about it, I've conceived another one. To continue with your baby metaphor, but so I've written a second book. There's a little blurb about it on my website called Burner. It doesn't carry the story or characters a bit flip forward. It's a totally different story, but it really wrestles. My lane, I've decided, and what I feel passionate about and what I like to talk about on my blog, if you read my blog, is what is the impact of technology on our lives, not just for people in the industry, but for people out of the industry. And Burner takes a perspective of a younger protagonist, actually a couple, a male and female protagonist, and it also leans into the political discussion a little bit more. There's not a lot of politics in BitFlip. He is kind of a leader of an anonymous alt-right movement, online movement, sort of almost reluctant leader of it. And she is a progressive Instagram celebrity and daughter of a tech billionaire. So, they're kind of polar opposite, both politically and socioeconomically. But unbeknownst to anybody, they are also in love. And so it's a little bit more Instagram generation story, if you will. My son is a beta reader right now. He's 19, and he said, "I'm loving it." So I'm hoping I can reach other generations with it. So.
Well, you're doing something right if you can get your 19-year-old son to
Absolutely, yes. Both my kids read BitFlip too, so not because I made them.
Also a good sign. So we should get BitFlip and read it soon, so we can also be waiting for the next book.
Absolutely.
We do want to open it up to questions from the audience if folks have thoughts.
So, Mike, did you keep a diary? Did you write down these things that you went through so that you could remember them?
The question, I'm sorry, yeah, please.
The question is, how long did it actually take you to write the book
Oh, gosh.
once you developed it yourself?
Yeah. So the question was, did I keep a diary or journal of events? I really didn't. I kind of have, folks who are friends of mine know I have a ready arsenal of stories that I share. And I think that's a good, sometimes notes anchor you in things that aren't as interesting. And I find that the things that my brain retains, the best material kind of bubbles to the top. So, and I should further clarify that, the book is not a thinly veiled memoir. Some of the incidents sort of happen, but nothing in the book is based on a specific person or character or incident. And so I kind of took little tidbits, though, of things that I remember or kind of stuck in my mind or seemed particularly emblematic of a kind of mindset or behavior in Silicon Valley. There's a character in the book called Peter Green, who's this kind of eccentric, reclusive billionaire type, and becomes kind of Sam's anti-mentor, as I describe it. And he was a fun one to write because, we all know, or we think we know, a lot of billionaires through the press that they get and stuff like that. And so it was fun to kind of bake some of those behaviors and traits into it. The second question, in terms of how long did it take to write, I mean, I feel like I should answer that question in two parts, because I probably first opened a Word document, hit save, and titled it BitFlip 3 decades ago. No, I mean, it was honestly probably 5 years ago that I first started putting some thoughts down. But for 2+ years, I was again doing it nights, weekends. I wrote, I'd say, an undisciplined first draft where it was way longer than it needed to be, and there were a lot of really boring stretches. And that was another benefit for me of COVID is, I sort of took a step back. I did work with a developmental editor during that time, and that was incredibly helpful to me because I find editing my own work hard, and as a lot of authors do, and it was great to have that external perspective and feedback. The other thing that is critical, and this is the stage I'm at with the new book, Burner, is beta readers. I mean, it's just like from my tech days, if you don't get it into the wild and get user feedback firsthand, you have no idea what it is. You lose all objectivity. And so I've sent that manuscript for the second book out to a handful of beta readers, a couple of them are in the room today, and I'm getting feedback, which is super, super helpful.
So knowing what you know and having been on this path, do you think you'd ever jump out into the pond and use your power for good?
Do I think I'd ever jump back into the pond? I assume the pond is back into like a role at a tech company.
Yeah.
I don't foresee that right now. But this is sort of the subtlety of the book, is that it's not an indictment of the tech industry, full stop. I love technology. I've spent my career doing it. Almost all my friends are in the tech industry. And so I definitely wouldn't rule it out. But it would depend on the role. And I think something I've always done, I was mostly in marketing roles in my career. And so when you're head of marketing, you're often that chief evangelist, right? You're the one kind of singing the gospel. And I like that. That's kind of adjacent to writing, so I could see maybe getting into a company in a capacity of, a lot of companies are hiring kind of in-house journalists, essentially, right? Content marketing people, as they're called. So maybe perhaps a role like that. But right now, I love doing what I'm doing. I think the part that I probably miss the most about my career is working with a group of people. We had the benefit of doing that. Nothing is more enjoyable than being part of a team that accomplishes something. You still have that in writing. You do have a team. You have a publisher, a copywriter, editor, publicist. It takes a village to get a book out the door. But that day-to-day interaction with a team is always really fun. So anyway, but probably not. Depends. How many books I crank out too. What the body of work is. Yeah.
So did you change your process at all into writing book two from lessons you learned in writing book one?
Yeah, did you change your process at all? Yes, I think I was more diligent in my outlining in book two. You hear that a lot. I think book one, also, they're very different books because book one, although it's written in the third person about a different character, it's very relatable to me. A lot of the scenes and experiences are ones that have been close to ones I've had, or were actually ones I've had. So, I think as a first-time author, writing kind of in your voice, in your experience, it's going to come a little bit easier. With the second book, it's not me, it's a younger character. It's told in the first person. It's got a dual first-person narration, both male and female. So this is my first time writing first-person and female voice, which has been a fun challenge. But I think that caused me to be a little bit more disciplined too, kind of in, okay, what's my process? What's the story? How's the story going to unfold? Now, in the whole literary world, they talk about, what is it? Pantsers, plotters and pantsers, is that the phraseology, right? Pantsers are by the seat of their pants, they just write. And my method is sort of in between where plot it out, I do an outline, but then I oftentimes just break that outline completely. I'll stumble upon an interesting thread and I'll pull that, and I'll get feedback and I'll just go in a slightly different direction. So I allow myself the chance to modify it as I go. Any questions from the walk-ins? Thanks for joining us. By the way, books are for sale. They're great stocking stuffers.
Mike, do you have an ebook edition of this?
Yes, there's an ebook edition available everywhere you buy ebooks. And then I'm very excited to say there's an audiobook edition coming out soon as well. I just need to find the 9 hours to listen to the last version of it myself, but it's in theory done. It just needs the final proof, and that should be out and available again all the places you get audiobooks. Hopefully in about a month or so. No, I did not narrate it. That would have been catastrophic. I did. Well, there are, talk about like hidden files that can be uncovered someday. It was recommended to me as a final proofread of your book to read it out loud. Because your brain, it's amazing. You gloss over stuff that you hear sometimes that you don't see. It's really phenomenal, or fascinating. And so I did, and I thought, well, if I'm going to read the whole thing out loud, I might as well record it. So I did record myself reading the entire book, and I did edit it enough to make it like legible, or what's the word I'm looking for? Auditorial.
It's a new word now.
I don't know what the legible equivalent for listening is, but hearable. So yeah, if somebody wants to spend a lot of money, maybe that could be my NFT version of the book. I don't know if anybody got that joke. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Now that it's come out, are you noticing any interesting overlaps between doing events like this in the Bay Area and what your past experience with events?
Oh, I mean, it's just been, I can't put into words how great it feels to just get, emails from people and kudos and to reconnect. Mehran and I haven't seen each other in probably 10 plus years. We worked together back in the day. It's everybody who's caught wind of this book has been so incredibly supportive, which is wonderful. I got it almost brought a tear to my eye. I got an email from the father of a guy I knew in high school who just randomly read the book, and he has no reason he has to send me a nice note, but it was great to get that. So that's super fun. All that said, a lot of the push here is to kind of break beyond my circle of friends and colleagues and family, and find people who find my audience, really find people who like the book, read the book speaks to them in whatever way. And that's really what I'm looking for. Yeah.
I think you've done a great service here, and I have to imagine you fictionalizing your experience and others has been somewhat cathartic. I'm a native of this city and observed some of the aspects of your novel in the evolution of the Bay Area economics and technology development. I'm curious to know, based upon your understanding and fictionalization of what's occurred down there, greed is good. I mean, what does it tell you about the human? I mean, all humans are opportunists, and people have a pathology. I mean, how much is enough?
Yeah.
And mistreating people and all the many ethical and legal things that you have observed that I think have articulated in fiction. So what does it tell you just about?
It's an excellent question. I think that is one of the bigger conundrums about the tech industry and the, those of us living here have seen the marginalization and gentrification and some of the negative aspects of that. And yet, by and large, many people in the tech industry themselves are, myself, I'm politically progressive, right? So you realize, like, this is being done by by people who sort of have the right moral compass and political persuasion in the first place, and yet it still has this incredibly pernicious effect, on many people's lives in the Bay Area. I'll give you an example. I don't want to pick on an individual, but I will pick on an individual. Mark Andreessen. I hold an incredible high regard professionally. The man has done incredible things.
Twitter?
He started Netscape, and he now runs a venture capital fund. He has been actively opposed to affordable living in Atherton, where he lives, right? And yet invested in Adam Newman's, the founder of WeWork's new consumer-focused real estate site. I don't know him. I don't know what motivated that, but god damn, is that hypocritical, right? So I think that's the kind of loss, untethering of what life is like here. Are we going to turn Silicon Valley into a playground just for the wealthiest?
That's what it
people?
is.
Right.
That's what it's become, sir.
Right. So and there are many segments. Sounds like you've read the book. In the book that point to that.
No, I just walked in. I haven't read your book. The point is, I got it because I'm a speed reader and I read the back page. And I'm
Fantastic. Well, thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate
I'll
it.
sign your copy when you
I know I'm going over to Mexico Wednesday. My bags are packed.
All right.
Honestly, I'll look and see if it's online. My point is, I'm saddened because I grew up in Marin County. I call it the Aspenization of all the beautiful places. My oldest friend, Meltown, was solid. The self-entitled, judgmental people, I just look past them. I'm biking to a valley now.
Yeah.
My point is, I'm saddened. Where are the poor people going to live who clean these toilets
and
and
there's
cut the vegetables? They
yeah.
can't afford it. And Love and Breathe looks like Willie Brown and Drag. And I miss George Moscone Hug and Love. And I am a native, very sad that I walk into the library at the Civic Center and there's now a guard in the bathroom because homeless people have been going in there and screwing it up. That's a sad statement.
I agree. And I thank you for coming today. Sincerely. No,
I just stopped in. I didn't even know.
I know.
You know,
So other questions? I want to leave time for
good
other
luck.
people.
Make it maybe a bestseller.
Thank you.
You're getting
Appreciate
paid.
Anyone else? Anyone? All right. And then, question to that.
Yeah, so it feels like what I've heard from the book and kind of your appearances, it deals with the ambiguity of things, right? Like, it can be kind of good, it can be bad.
Yeah.
Is it touched on in the book, like where that kind of the bad parts come from? It seems to me like it's disrupting influences of funding models.
And I think that's, again, Mehran asked sort of what is the message, what is the theme? But I think the message is, there aren't good guys and bad guys. There's a lot of the impacts on Silicon Valley and on the life of the Bay Area are almost structural side effects, if you want to call them that. Again, there was this idealism in the tech sector of we're making the world a better place. Right. That is what we do.
What happened to that?
And hallelujah. And so I think you need to, recognize that in spite of that best intention, that hasn't happened. And certainly not for everybody. And so I think that's the reconjuring I want people to have. I want people to read the book and sort of say, what can I do to actually live up to that purpose? So, well, I know many of you, just because I know some of you, have bought the book already. I'd encourage you to buy the book again. I can't tell you. Not for me, because I don't get a lot of money off each sale, but for Book Passage, I can't tell you, as I've researched different markets around the country, between Book Passage and Booksync, where I spoke earlier this week, these are true local treasures. I mean, many cities do not have the benefit of a true independent bookstore, micro chain bookstore, 2 locations for Book Passage. And we should cherish them, we should support them. I thank them for supporting me. And so thank them by buying a book.
Get one for a friend or family member.
Any other questions?
I have more if there are others out there.
I'll ask. Did you have anxiety, given you had such an awesome career, and you thinly veiled, well, you didn't even thinly veil, you fictionalized it. But I gotta imagine as an author, there's anxiety that people in your life will recognize themselves and feel something. And so how did that affect the content as it came out?
So the question was, do you think people you know would see themselves sort of in the characters in the book? I consider that honestly a compliment when people sort of say that, because to me what's implicit behind that statement is these characters feel really real, and a lot of people, I mentioned that character Peter Green, a lot of people have been like, oh, is that based on so-and-so, is that based on so-and-so? It's like, no, that is a truly fictionalized character, kind of a composite of a number of different people and different characteristics. And so, and that is genuinely the truth about every character in the book. There are, I often describe these sort of like composite characters. There might have been a thing that I heard or a thing that I saw, but I don't combine that into the same persona. I try to figure out, okay, how can that attitude, be borrowed and amalgamated with other attributes that might make that character kind of feel authentic to what they're sort of representing in the storyline. The one I've worked with so many great venture capital investors, and the 3 VCs who are investors in the company are kind of not portrayed in the best light. And I've sort of said, VC, they're maybe now second only to lawyers, is like the most vilified profession. And all the VCs I've worked with have been great. They've been wonderful people. It's again, the book is almost more a comment about the structure of startups and venture capital as it is the behavior of the individuals in there, right? The structure of venture capital creates certain incentives for everybody involved, from the investors to the LPs up and to the operators of the companies on down. And that was part of what I'm trying to impart in the book, is the experience of knowing that and sort of trying to share that maybe with a wider audience. Yeah.
So just continuing on what you just said, do you have any opinions on alternative structures? Or since you have a lot of experience in this space?
That's a great question. Do I have opinions about alternative structures? So venture capital, gosh, you could wind me up and spin me down the road here for a while. This might be a longer, off-topic answer. But if you look at the history of venture capital, it was designed for high-risk industries that were capital-intensive. Microprocessors and being, sort of the key example of that, with Fairchild and all that. Where venture capital is gone now is into companies that, frankly, don't need very much money. If you're 5 people writing code for some app, you run it on AWS, you need money for salaries. That's about it. And so I think that over time has kind of led to some of the sort of oddness we see in that structure of traditional venture capital being applied to modern companies, where you see there's now over 1,300 unicorn companies, private companies with over $1 billion valuation. That's fucking crazy. Sorry, that's crazy, right? That to me is where I start to feel like regulatory oversight would be beneficial, because those companies are private not because they aren't big enough or profitable enough to be public. It's because they don't want to be. They don't want to abide by the additional scrutiny and regulation that is required of a public company. So I think there are things like that that have kind of become loopholes, for lack of a better term, in that structure that we should revisit. We as in the government of the United States. And for great ideas on that, read Systemair. They have a multidisciplinary, I can't remember your co-author's background, so I think one's philosophy, one's ethics, is that right? Or political science. And so they bring just it isn't we should do this and they should do that. It's no, you should pass this act. You should do this thing. It's very pragmatic and thoughtful. dish falls over the audience.
I could ask you a follow-up on
Yes,
that,
please.
which is, you also mentioned that you recently done a blog post about not having more regulation. And so how do you, to have more regulation? Were there particular things, like how did you get to that conclusion? Were there particular things that you think are important? To
Yeah, I mean, I'll again call out my wife Leslie here in the second row, not front row, I noticed. But she's in the medical device world, which is, as you probably know or can imagine, is a heavily regulated industry. One might say over-regulated industry. But when I contrast her space to the space I spent my career in tech, there ain't no regulatory oversight in tech. And, frankly, when companies get to the scale of Facebook or Google or whatever, they're conducting what would be called in the medical device space clinical trials on hundreds of millions of people with no consequence, right? And it can have tremendously negative effects. Now, you're not putting a drug in your body, you're not, but there are real impacts to these things. And I think that would be an interesting place to start, is to, maybe require past a certain scale, or there's a lot of devil in the details for this, but to require some visibility for the public into what is this new thing you're building, what does your research show you it will do, what are the analytics behind, the beta tests that you've done, so that we know, what's being unleashed on us and on our children.
It's interesting because there's actually, and just thinking of it now, a parallel to that in the book, and I don't know if you intended this or not, but you sort of see in the book Sam's emotional journey around grappling with his values and what he believes in, and where he ends up. And if you look at a lot of the tech industry, right, you have idealistic people who come in, and then as those companies get bigger, they take their market power and turn it into political power. So you see folks like the Ubers of the world coming in and saying, you know what, we're trying to make transportation more democratic. But what we're actually doing on the back end is also fighting against regulation that makes our drivers classified as employees so they would get benefits, right? And so there's this evolution also going on at a corporate level of what the values and culture are. How do you think about that parallel to Sam's own journey? Do you see that in other companies, that they start off idealistic and then move somewhere else?
Yeah, I think there's a deeply, deeply rooted in the DNA of tech of like disruption is good, right? Like always. And usually what that means is disruption for the benefit of us at our company is good, and we don't know, care, or consider what disruption it might have on other people. And so I do think that it's easy to lose sight of that. It's super easy to lose sight of that when you're inside the company. I've been the one that's lost sight of that. That's sort of the theme of the day, but I think that's self-regulation, for the most part, fortunately, has worked, right? I mean, you don't see that many, for the number of tech startups that there are, you don't see that many Theranoses or whatever. But the power of some of these companies, Uber being a great example, Facebook being a great example, Google being a great example, they really have already transcended governments, most governments. I mean, you mentioned the other day, like compared to the government of France, Facebook's policy affects way more people than whatever the French government is doing, whatever they are doing. I don't know what they're doing. But that is another reason that I think, before the thing gets completely out of the box, to start to figure out, okay, how do we coexist? How do we have enough regulatory oversight on some of these companies that we at least know when bad stuff is happening, and can hopefully mitigate those negative side effects.
Do you feel the federal government is actually doing that, or has Facebook so many lobbyists that they're getting away with?
Well, the ironic thing, the tech industry only recently realized that they needed to be lobbying, right? Like I used to work on Capitol Hill, and none of the tech companies had lobbyists, right? Like it wasn't. There was sort of this Wild West mentality of like, we don't need to lobby, we'll just release a new version of our software, or whatever. And so it's a pretty new phenomenon that they even sort of hired lobbyists. And they've jumped in with both feet for sure. I think every industry has a right to lobby the government. That's part of our system. But it's a bit of an unfair fight, right? I mean, there's sort of unlimited resources on one end, and frankly, unlimited ability to kind of affect the narrative. I think when you look at a platform like Facebook, its ability to subtly manipulate the narrative is a little scary, honestly, right? And in another generation, with the advent of television, I think our government was more sensitive to that. This was in the aftermath of World War II and the recognition of how misinformation and disinformation can be used to manipulate an entire population. There were pretty stringent laws about television and equal access and all sorts of different things don't exist at all, basically, in the internet landscape. So anyway, I feel like it's a good point to wrap on.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And so, first of all, we wanted to thank the folks at Book Passage for having this event. Thank you very much for allowing us to use this space, for bringing people together, and for the role you play in the community to actually help bring people together and get us a little away from those screens for a while so we can enjoy each other's company. Mike, thank you very much for the conversation, for writing a really engaging book, which is a wonderful conversation. And thanks to all of you for coming and for taking part in this event and for contributing to your community. So take care of each other, take care of yourselves, and we will hopefully see you in the future at a future Book Passage event.
Thank you, everybody. I have Sharpies. Next time. Thank you, everybody.
And thank you again, everyone, for being here for this. It's lovely. Thank you for the lovely conversation.